Hi, all. Welcome to Spark FX's celebration of Fifth Element here, celebrating its 25th anniversary. My name is Royce Anthony. I'm the Global Head of Research at DNEG, and joining me is Scott Ross. And Scott, if you could introduce yourself as well as your relationship to the film, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. First of all, it's shocking when you say it's the 25th anniversary because back when this was made, I guess I was 45 years old and I thought I was old back then. So I'm not sure what that says about me today. But um, my name is Scott, and I was the owner and CEO and chairman of Digital Domain. I was the founder of it. I started the company back in 1993 after leaving Light and Magic and Lucasfilm as being a senior VP and the general manager of ILM and all digital services when I finally left. And Fifth Element was a project that was very interesting to us for so many reasons, the most of which was A, it's become a classic, B, I think it launched the career of Mark Stetson as a visual effects supervisor. And it was, I don't know if it was the last, but might be one of the last films that use extensive real world models as opposed to computer generated images.
Yeah, and you mentioned the use of models. Indeed, tons and tons and tons of miniature work at various scales on this. You're showing an example here. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this model and how it was used in the film.
Well, again, this was a very big, well, now it's changed. It was a very big model. Most of the models were, I forget what the scale of it was, but they were large. We took up most of the shooting stages at Digital Domain. Again, it was in a transition. So when I started the company in 1993 as its founder, having left Industrial Light and Magic, CGI and digital work was sort of just coming of age. So I left just as we were doing Jurassic Park. We had finished The Abyss and Terminator 2. And so I realized that digital was going to be the future, hence the name Digital Domain. But when I built the company, I built it in many ways in the same way that I had transitioned out of ILM, which was shooting stages with motion control and big motion control rigs and VistaVision cameras and shooting on film, and lots of models and miniatures. And so this was a unique project in that, as I said, it's one of the last big model miniature shows that visual effects has ever done.
About how many model makers and other ancillary artists worked on it, given the number of models that are actually used in the film?
I think our model shop was somewhere around 35 to 40 people. There's Mark Stetson, you can see as a young man, shooting with a giant motion control rig. I would say 35 to 40 people in the model department, probably about 6 or 7 people in the art department, and maybe 35 to 40 people on the digital side.
Gotcha. And Mark Stetson, you mentioned he worked on a few other like large scale model projects as well prior to the Fifth Element. I think uh,
Blade Runner. He was,
yeah, Blade Runner.
Mark made his name as the model supervisor on Ridley Scott's Blade Runner.
So there's like almost maybe no chance that there would have been a better suited individual for the aesthetic for the Fifth Element, kind of
Yeah,
following
I don't, I mean, it was interesting when I hired Mark and brought him on board. We weren't even talking about the Fifth Element. It was for the fact that we were looking for the ability to be able to build out our model shop, and Mark Stetson owned a company called Stetson Visual Services, which was, in my opinion, one of the top model shops in the LA area. And so when I was looking to build out the model shop at DD, I approached Stetson and asked him if he would be willing to sell his company and be subsumed by Digital Domain. And there wasn't a whole lot of sort of conversation or discussion or negotiation. He was thrilled to do it. And one of the caveats to the acquisition was we would take all of his equipment, but in addition, we would wind up naming him as a visual effects supervisor because he always wanted to make the transition. But oftentimes, particularly back then, and maybe even at this point, there's most of the crew. Particularly at that point, once you were very good at something in a specific area, it became very difficult for you to move out of that specific area. So,
Right.
Stetson was considered the top model supervisor in Hollywood at the time, and there was probably no chance or very little chance that he would move up to becoming a visual effects supervisor to oversee an entire show. So that was something that I saw in Mark as a leader, and a really great artist, a good communicator, and the stuff that he didn't know about computer generated imagery or compositing, for example, we supported him with great number 2 and number 3 people. So he made the transition. We acquired his company, and then I think he worked on a commercial or two before Fifth Element, and then Luc Besson approached us, and Fifth Element came to bear, and it was the perfect job for Mark. And as they say, the rest is history.
Gotcha. So the style of Fifth Element kind of it has a unique aesthetic. Was Besson very particular about that style and how it looked, or was that a very collaborative experience between the VFX soup and the producer on the film as well as Besson, etc.?
Luc is very particular about everything. He's particular about the way you make his eggs. I mean, this guy is, he's a world-class director, and he's French. So he's an incredibly particular dude. He wound up hiring Jean-Claude Mézières and Mobius to do a bunch of concept drawings, some of which you see here. And as a result of that, he worked really closely with that group, and then went away and shot, I think it was The Professional or La Femme Nikita, I don't remember which one. He went away, and so the project went on hold for a while. And then when he came back, he continued to refine, the work, and then at that point, he brought in Digital Domain, and Digital Domain had an art department. I think it was Ira Guilford and Ron Gress, who just recently passed away, may he rest in peace, to refine what Mézières and Mobius did, and of course Luc was intimately involved in all of those art pieces and all of that concept art, and that's what you're seeing here.
Definitely a very unique look. I think that's one of the reasons. The mix of practical and effects work, I think, is one of the main reasons why the Fifth Element as a film still holds up today. It's beautiful to watch, beautiful to look at. Lots of pride, I reckon, in a lot of these shots. But I understand that in one of these shots, there's a little bit of an Easter egg, actually, where you might be in.
Actually, we just passed it. I wish I could. There it is. Take it back there. So if you look, I don't know if you can see it, but if you look on the ledge in the white chinos, there's a young man about 45 years of age playing alto saxophone, and that was shot on an insert stage at Digital Domain. And that's yours truly, surrounded by some Digital Domain employees, because I was always made fun of that I would be playing saxophone during the day. So, everybody would be working, and of course I'd pull out my horn and I'd be playing, my favorite things or something. And people would come by the office and they'd say, well, that was great, et cetera, et cetera. So Mark thought it would be funny to put me in this shot. And I think that's the only cameo appearance I have in a major motion picture.
Fantastic. Fantastic. When thinking about some of these unique looks and aesthetics, what were some of the inspirations, if you recall, for
Well,
creating?
remember, as we talked earlier, it's sort of my job was never really to be actively involved in each one of the productions. I like to say things like, well, the companies that I owned or the companies that I manage won, 9 Academy Awards for visual effects, but it really had nothing to do with me. It's sort of like,
Yeah.
Steve Jobs saying, well, the Macintosh was all Steve Jobs. Well, no, Steve wasn't a programmer. Steve was the chairman and CEO of the company. And so I had an executive producer at the time. I think it was Andrew Milstein, um, who oversaw all of production for feature films. I had an executive producer for our commercials division, Ed Ulbrich, who oversaw all production for commercials. And we were doing, I don't know, 50, 60 commercials a year. And then we had a group called, at back then, the New Media Group. So I had an executive producer involved in what was CD-ROM and video games. And those were our three revenue sources. And then reporting to each one of those people were producers. And in this case, on Fifth Element, it was Dan Lombardo. And Dan Lombardo reported to Andrew Milstein, who reported to me. So I was really not hands-on on any of the work. I know, as I used to say, I know enough to get in trouble, but not enough to actually do anything. So, and that's why I surrounded myself with really great people, and I was lucky to have them. So, in terms of the look and the design, I had no input whatsoever. It really was Stetson and Ira and Ronnie Gress that really had the major input with Luke on the way things looked.
Well, and I really, what you're saying really resonates very strongly with me. Like the idea that truly you're celebrating the work of your team, and the team that you brought together in order to be successful here. And I think, paying homage to the folks that did the work is truly honorable. Clearly, you must have been really fun to work with at the time.
Yeah,
Sharing
my
and
my
learning
my.
experience.
It's funny when you say that. One of my partners in Digital Domain was a fellow, may he rest in peace, called Stan Winston, and the name of his studio was Stan Winston Studio. He always used to bust me on the fact that there was no S at the end of studio. It was studios. It was studio, and jokingly, in a fun way, Stan would always say, basically everything that comes out of Stan Winston Studio is about Stan Winston. Now, I happen to know the people that work for Stan Winston, and I could tell you that without the people that were standing behind the owner of the company, Stan Winston Studio would have done nothing like the way that they did it. So in this case, I wasn't even the creative person, nor the technical person at Digital Domain. I was the CEO. And so I was lucky enough to work or have incredible people work with me at Digital Domain to create these images and wind up winning Academy Awards and work on iconic films.
Gotcha. And I think like any great jazz outfit, it's really the makeup and the experience that you have in that collective that produces the output.
Yeah, we as a saxophone player, we always get better if our rhythm section is great. And Stetson here had an incredible rhythm section as well. I mean, his team was world class. Bill Neal was his director of photography, and there was a plate crew that lived in England while Luke was shooting Fifth Element, and so it was an incredibly collaborative effort for a visual effects movie of the time. So Digital Domain got to work in pre-production. That was rare back then. I'm not sure what's happening now, but back then the opportunity to have your team and your art department work in direct collaboration with production was almost unheard of.
Yeah, there was a few structural changes then on this. Maybe if we press play on the slideshow and then look through a few more visuals, perhaps talk a little bit more about that distributed workflow, because I think you're right on that you're moving to a new world. Digital Domain is looking at the digital, right? So you're trying to say, okay, models and traditional painting is important, but there are other things that are important. I know, in compositing, you mentioned some early ideas here for solutions like Nuke, as well as these distributed workflows that, well, industry wide, we kind of enjoy today, right?
So, because Lucasfilm used to own Pixar, and I was, interestingly enough, I'm like Forrest Gump. I wound up in these places that were just bizarre for me. I had just had a meeting. I had left ILM and Lucasfilm, and I was forming Digital Domain, and I flew down to Burbank to meet with Cameron and Winston. And on my way back, I went to the airport, to Burbank Airport, and my flight was delayed. And so I went into the bar to have a beer, and I'm sitting there, and there's this racket happening behind my head. And I turn around, and it's John Lasseter and Ralph Guggenheim, and one or two of the other and Ed Catmull. And they're carrying on. I walked over to them and I said, what's going on? And they said, oh, we just put together a deal with Disney. We're going to have a multi-picture output deal with Disney. And so we're transitioning into a production company. So it was always my thought when I started Digital Domain that Digital Domain would become like Pixar in the sense that we would be a production company and own our own content. Because having run ILM for the number of years that I did, I realized that being in the visual effects, quote, business was not really a business at all, and that you couldn't ever make money. And so the people that were making money and bringing value to shareholders and to the business were people that owned the intellectual property. So it was my intention to be able to be the live action version of Pixar. And I thought that the animation field was getting very crowded, with PDI moving into becoming DreamWorks, and there were a whole bunch, and I guess it was what was the name? Blue Sky winding up, being acquired by Fox, and so there were 3 visual effects slash animation companies that had wound up being major animation studios. So I looked at that as being a terribly crowded field. So where would the skills of a Digital Domain apply? And they would apply to live action, big budget, popcorn crunching kinds of films. And as Pixar had John Lasseter, who was their creative force, well, shoot, I had James Cameron. So it was obvious to me from a strategic point of view that Digital Domain needed to become a live action producer of films, and that given our capabilities on the visual effects side, what we really needed to do is we really needed to build our own tools, because there weren't really readily available commercial tools in the digital world at that time to build a world-class compositor. So it was my software team's efforts, and particularly a fellow by the name of Phil Beffrey and a couple of others around him, that wound up building the first iteration of Nuke. So Nuke became our compositing tool, and we were, in my opinion, well ahead of the curve of any other compositing tool that was out there, which would allow us to do miniatures, model shots, etc., motion control, and then do digital compositing in a digital world. I didn't really at the time really think that the digital side of things, the CG side of things, more apropos, would actually replace models at the time I built Digital Domain. So for example, when we did Titanic in 1997, we built a 1/6 scale version of the actual Titanic in our model department. Now again, if that was to be done today, there would be no models. It would all be modeled within, some software package.
Well, that's really true, and I know that in some respects there were, of course, there was digital work used on the Fifth Element. Example, doing my research, the evil effect, the big ball of evil, surrounded by models of ships and composited. Later, the evil effect was realized with RenderMan, Prisms, Alias, which later, of course, was absorbed by Wavefront, and then Autodesk. A lot of these softwares were really in their infancy at the time of making of this film. So I have to wonder, what was it like working with a lot of these early tools and emerging tools, and creatives like your team, Karen Gulikes and Besson, etc., and in kind of trying to get to that final look, knowing that really a lot of these tools were just sort of emerging.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of problems. Particularly, we see it's funny. When you're in the middle of madness and you can't see sanity, then madness seems sane. So at the
Love that.
time, we didn't think to ourselves, geez, we're in these early stages of these software packages, and what the hell are we going to do, and how are we going to do it? It just
Right.
the way it was the way it was, right? And so what we were tasked with was our software department to be able to come up with a pipeline so that all of these various software packages that were appropriate for certain portions or elements of the film could actually work together. And that was really the effort of our long-term software development team to build that pipeline. But again, we were using all of these off-the-shelf 3D CGI kinds of products that were, now we look back in its infancy. At the time, it was, you mean we don't have to write an entire software package? We can use Alias Wavefront? And
Yeah, yeah.
so at that time, it was a breath of fresh air. It wasn't, holy crap, what are we doing here? It
Right.
actually allowed us to do the things we needed to do, and we needed to figure out a way for the pipeline to work.
And regarding the pipeline in distributed, were a lot of the teams local when it came down to production, or were they distributed and working on separate shots in different regions where the filming actually occurred?
I love that question. That shows sort of generational discrepancy.
Yep.
So at the time, now we're not talking about production. We're not talking about live action production, right? You're talking about post-production production, right?
Correct. Post
Okay.
production.
Because live action production was done in England, right? And there was a small team of digital domain people working closely with the live action team. But back home in the States, um, the concept of working in multiple locations, or even the concept of working with multiple vendors, was an
Yeah.
anathema, right? It was all under one roof. Everything was under one roof. So we didn't go out to sub vendors. We didn't ask anybody to do anything. Everything was brought in-house, and our teams worked together in close proximity and would meet day after day after day after day.
Yeah, it is a dramatic shift here. 25 years later, software like Prisms has of course become Houdini, and Alias Wavefront and Power
Right,
Animators
right,
become Maya. Like
right.
all of these things have changed, and even the pipelining and workflows have become globally distributed, built on internet and cloud-based technology. So yeah, some really dramatic shifts. There's a specific reason why I wanted to highlight it, because there's an intent. There's a difference in that workflow, and you mentioned everything's in house, so you have to collect your coalition of the willing in house and really furiously work together in a unique experience that we don't really have as much today.
Correct,
Regarding
correct.
the filming, I know you being a musician. I heard a little bit of a rumor that occasionally you guys would all go see Bruce Willis play.
Yeah, Bruce Willis is a harmonica player, and he played in a rock slash blues band, and he would play in London. I wound up going over there with Andrew Milstein because there was some sort of issues regarding our crew, and wanting to make Luke feel, comfortable that everything was being handled back at the shop. So he sort of had to bring in the suits, and I guess I was one of the suits. And it was freezing cold. First of all, England, as if you've shot in England, particularly in the wintertime, it's brutal. And the sound stages were freezing, and we would walk around in the snow, freezing our asses off, and we would always wind up at some bar. And every once in a while, we would wind up at a bar where Bruce Willis would be playing.
It's kind of bizarre to think, but yeah, it just goes back to that community comment that you mentioned. You're doing your production work out in London, then you're pulling everything back to studio in the US, and everyone's kind of triaging and cramming and working together. Maybe what are some of your favorite stories from the experience of that production and the filming component before you got to the post-production phases? Like, do you have any outstanding moments that you might want to mention about
Well,
what it was like on
once
set?
again, so I'm ensconced in my office dealing with all of my executives and my partners who at times, were not a walk in the park. I believe we were doing multiple shows at that time. I'm trying to remember if it was Apollo 13, Fifth Element, and Dante's Peak all at the same time. And so it was a major cluster, you know what, and there were lots of issues to be sort of sorted out, and it was difficult. So the things that I experienced around Fifth Element was I would sit in a screening room and watch the dailies and get pretty excited about the work. The trip to England was very, very interesting, but basically, I was filling potholes. My job, I would come home, my wife at the time would ask me, how'd it go at work today? It was like, well, it was almost always terrible. Because I never did really get to do the creative stuff. I just was putting out fires. That was my job as a fireman.
Well, and that's a really important thing to point out, though, as well, is that anyone in a leadership position in production, this is what you're doing. You're unblocking folks so that they can get their creative work done. And you're trying to ensure that safe place. When you were looking in the dailies theater, you were reviewing some of those elements. Did you know Fifth Element was going to be a hit in the way that it was?
I didn't know it was going to. I knew it was going to be a film that was extraordinary because we've never, the bizarreness of Luc Besson, right, and the bizarreness of the designs, and ultimately the story in and of itself was such a bizarre story. It didn't follow typical three-part structure, and it was so very different than films that were being made at the time, both visually and story-wise, that I knew it was going to be a mind blower. I didn't know if it was going to be successful, right? Because I didn't know if American audiences in particular were smart enough, hip enough, and understanding enough to accept a film like that. And in fact, I think, and again, my memory doesn't serve me very well, but I think it did not do big box office in the early part, and that it's become a classic over time. And now men and women that are your age talk about The Fifth Element sort of in hushed tones. But at the time, I don't think American audiences understood what the film was about. So I can't speak to European audience, but North American audiences were like, who is this blue lady with this crap hanging out of there? What are they talking about,
Such an iconic scene. The music in The Fifth Element was outstanding.
But again, it was such a European sort of avant-garde sensibility to the film. Steven Spielberg would not make that movie, right? It's just not in his wheelhouse. He'll make Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which will be, or E.T., but not a movie like this. I mean, this is sort of space opera, bizarre, weird stuff,
Yeah, absolutely. Like you mentioned, it's kind of quirky. There's that it's almost anachronistic in the opera house sequence. This is not something even in the 90s that you would kind of expect as, well, this is right. Culture and it's going to resonate with everybody. So
here's a fun story. So at the end of Fifth Element, Patrice Ledoux, who was the producer of the film, who I got to know relatively well, he was the head of the French movie studio that produced and ultimately distributed the film in Europe, and he was a character. He was, sort of a stereotypical Frenchman. He smoked constantly, and I used to come to him and say, and my mother passed from lung cancer many years before, and I would go to him and say, Patrice, gotta put out the cigarette. What's going on? I would rather be skinny and dead than fat and not smoke. So that was the kind of guy he was. But at the end, I believe Patrice wound up making the obelisk of The Fifth Element, the final piece that fits in. And he gave them as crew gifts to all of the crew. and I loved it. You know, we would doing what I have done over the years. I've have all these interesting sort of gifts that people have put forth for the cruise. And one year, I was divorced like 2 years at this point, and I met this woman, and thought I was crazy in love with her, and so I wound up giving her the obelisk, right? Because the fifth element is love, right? And so I explained it to her and gave it to her, and there was this, and 2 months later, it didn't work out. We broke up. And a couple of years later, I called her on the phone and I said, "Can I have that obelisk back? I'd really like it." And she said, "Fuck you." So, so much for the fifth element of love.
So it's out there somewhere.
It's out there somewhere. If she's smart, she sold it on eBay.
Yeah. As I enter quickly, looking
Yeah,
for
right. As you
that
enter
for sale
eBay
on
and look for
Craigslist,
it.
Craigslist or wherever. Yeah, well, I have to think that like there must have been on the production side just a lot of Hail Mary passes. At 5 minutes, 70 plus shots, the cab chase sequence alone is like a third of Digital Domain's Fifth Element effects, according to my source. Um,
Here's
that's
a wacky one. There are only 225 shots in the fifth element.
yeah, I saw that and I thought that it was a miss because sure, Jurassic Park 50 or so, but nowadays it'd be thousands.
Yeah,
So 220.
I saw Kelly Port a couple of weeks ago. He came up to Santa Barbara, and he was awarded an award at the Santa Barbara Film Festival for his work on Spider-Man. And I swore he said the number of shots were in the thousands.
Yeah, yeah, like that's today, and it's just it, it's a completely different. It would have been a completely different experience, nascent to what we would now call, to your point, nascent software tools. RenderMan as a renderer doing things that today it's behind the final delivery of tons of films. Side effects as Houdini, that back then Prisms, again, just hugely important today. It was super nascent tooling back then, and
Yeah, and the
70
fact
shots,
the
like
fact
that
that
was
the film was
incredible
shot in
number.
Super 35. I mean, think about that. The visual effects were shot in Super 35. We were shooting film back then. We weren't. There was no digital film to speak of.
It is intense. Um, yeah, I mean, obviously, a huge amount of effort put into the development and aesthetic. That New York scene, you have that crew shot where you're all kind of sitting in and around New York. Like how big was that? I know the Korben Dallas car model that is also that you also showed. That's about a sixth scale of a traditional automobile size. So these things are physically very large. It must have taken a lot of space.
Yeah, they were huge. It's hard for me to remember exactly the dimensions, but I mean, I think the buildings went as high as like, I want to say 12 feet, 14 feet in the air. So it was a giant set.
Yeah. It's, absolutely incredible. Well, I think here we are again celebrating the 25th anniversary. 25 years later, to your point, there's folks like myself, Gen Xers, that grew up with early computing and internets, and primarily our careers started digital. They didn't start analog at all. We look back at films like this and with a great deal of reverence and awe of the magic behind it. And I think having gone through this transition from traditional uh, special effects work into visual effects work, do you have any wisdom you might impart to new artists that are entering the field? So as to things they can look to for inspiration. How can they potentially path themselves in their careers as artists or producers and working in film? There has to be some wisdom you've gathered along the way. Maybe you could share a few pointers.
So a couple of things come up. One is I remember when way back in ILM, I'm going to say in the late 1980s, um, most of the work that we were doing was photochemical with optical printers. And a lot of the issues was the ability to limit the amount of film grain that was happening, which is why we shot VistaVision, and also the ability to be able to eliminate matte lines. So we were working on a project, I believe it was Indiana Jones 3, and there's a sequence where a P-51 Mustang flies into a tunnel. Of course, the P-51 Mustang is a miniature, the tunnel is a miniature, but we needed to shoot it. It was in daylight, and so we couldn't resolve the shot because there were matte lines all over the place. Daylight, you know, with a blue sky background, shooting against blue screen. So there was a guy who has since become very, very famous and is now, I believe, some super duper executive at Lucasfilm by the name of John Knoll. And John had come to us and said, you know, my brother and I are working on some compositing software. And so we wound up bringing, at the time, Macintosh. I want to say they were, I forget the model number, but it was like a 512 Macintosh. And we would set up in a room a group of people with, on one side, for the even frames, and the other side for the odd frames. And you'd work on an even frame, and then when you'd finish on your even frame in Photoshop, you'd then work on your odd frame, and then the even frame would render. And by the time you were finished with your odd frame, you could go back to the next even frame. And so that was sort of the beginning. That with that and the CGI group at Lucasfilm, which later became Pixar, was really the very early stages of digital compositing and computer-generated imagery. And as a result, I sort of saw the future of that happening because I came from video post-production where we had paint boxes and Harrys and telecines, and when I got to when I got to Industrial Light and Magic, they were still doing everything photochemically, and I couldn't quite understand it, right? We were just, and I didn't put two and two together, or really didn't put 525 and 2000 together. And I didn't understand that there was no capability of doing this work at that higher resolution. But it became obvious to me that we were moving in that direction. So I started hiring more computer graphics, digital people to be able to do the Abyss. And we had one of the great matte departments back then, and these matte artists painted on glass, on multi-plane glass, in the tradition of matte paintings for 50 years. And I set up a meeting between these new digital artists, quote unquote, that came in, and my matte department and my optical department. And I thought there would be a 3-day seminar where each one of those groups would present where they're coming from and what their background was. And about half a day later, I started noticing the digital guys and gals in the hallways, and I pulled one of them aside and I said, why aren't you still in that meeting? And the fellow had a German accent, and he said, well, actually we learned everything we need to learn from these old folks, and we're done with them, and now we're on to the next thing. So it was obvious to me that the future was going to be digital, and that there needed to be a transition from old school to new school. And at ILM, that was a very, very difficult transition, because what ILM had become by the late 1980s was a company that basically had, I would say, 75% market share, constantly won Academy Awards. They were the Rolls-Royce of the industry. And over the years, they had made enough mistakes to become the leader, and they were holding on to the way and the process by which they had always worked. And as a result, were really unwilling to change. And so it was quite an upheaval in the late 1980s making that transition. And now I'll move to musicians. So there's a great saxophone player by the name of Ornette Coleman, And Ornette Coleman sort of was the leader of working within a structure that was called outside jazz. So playing outside the harmonic structure of what jazz tunes were all about. And Ornette Coleman had a famous saying, and the famous saying was, before you learn to play outside, you really need to master playing inside. And so I don't know what it's like today because I've been out of the business now for about 10 or 15 years. But I would say to all of the people coming in that you really need to understand the way films are made, and you need to understand the way matte paintings were painted and models were shot and lighting was done and all of those things to become the best digital artist that you could become. Which brings me to the first time I saw, I guess it was Lord of the Rings, and the ability to move a digital camera back then was really easy, as it is today. One could just move camera within a 3D CGI world simply, but they were not taking into consideration the physics of what a camera can and cannot do in the real world. And as a result, a lot of the scenes within that film, I believe, really looked like a video game. So I think one needs to understand, even if you can do it, maybe
Yeah.
you shouldn't do it, right? Because it breaks that believability situation.
I think that's some pretty wise advice. Just there is a natural human experience, and what we're trying to do is replicate that in some to some degree, unless we're doing something hyper stylized. So
Yeah,
I
I
think it
think
makes a
even
lot of
if we're
sense.
Roy, I think even if we're doing something hyper stylized, if it's hyper stylized, but there are unnatural things that are happening that take you out of the believability of a scene, you
Right.
shouldn't do it. Yeah.
Solid advice. Thank you, Scott. Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation here, Scott. Celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Fifth Element and your career and the experience of, creating what Digital Domain did some fantastic work over, well, I mean, still does today, but has done some really fantastic work, especially in those early days of, that transition between special effects and visual effects, what we would consider it as normal today. It's been a wild ride, I'm sure, and for you, I suppose, a huge delightful surprise that a film like The Fifth Element can be as revered as it is today.
Pretty fun. And the other thing that's really cool, so the really cool thing is that the thing I get the most thrill out of is that the men and women that worked at Digital Domain 1.0 or even ILM have formed relationships, have become millionaires, have gotten married, have children, have built houses, and that's what gives me the most joy to see people doing that. So this year, um, once again, 7 out of the 30 nominees for Best Visual Effects were people that got their start working for me, and that gives me great joy too.
An incredible legacy. Incredible. Thank you so much, Scott. Really
You're
appreciate your
welcome,
time
Roy.
here today, and thank you for joining us.
You bet.